Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Hello, and welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth. My name is Peter Robbins, and I am your host. If you're watching or listening to the show, you're doing so on KGRA Digital Broadcasting if you're listening live, and you can access it on Facebook. Also, past shows run regularly on Spreaker, SPREAKER.com. Subscribe to KGRA using my first name as your subscription code, PETER, and you receive a full 30% discount. And let's move on to our guest. My friend Micah Hanks is a longtime advocate for scientific research into unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, as they're more often called now than UFOs. He is a contributing member of the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, SCU is the initials, and I'm a proud member as well as a frequent commentator and writer on the subject, and maintains an interest in the history and possible scientific explanations for aspects of the phenomena. You can learn about some of Micah's UAP research here and here. Micah's other interests include space studies, zoological mysteries, and unusual phenomena in nature. In 2020, Micah launched the increasingly popular and very influential The Debrief with journalists Tim McMillan and M.J. Banias, a news site and media enterprise which examines science and disruptive technology. Yeah, disruptive. The Debrief has closely followed developments relating to the U.S. government's collection and evaluation of information related to UAPs. You can follow Micah and his work at his website, micahhanks.com. That's MICAHHANKS.com, and by listening to his podcast, The Micah Hanks Program. Micah Hanks, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth.
Indeed. Wonderful to be here with you, Peter. We are long overdue, to say the very least. How are you, my friend?
No, it's great to see you again, and it brings back memories of our last meeting with our mutual friend and dear colleague, Ryan Sprague, and a very special day in New York City where I got to show off my stuff as a tour guide. And also, you are with us today from the south of Brazil, which I'm a little jealous of. I had a chance to visit there some years ago, and the culture is very unique, unlike anything certainly I had experienced. Tell us a bit about why you're there right now before we get into a line of questioning.
Yes, indeed. Well, I guess in all things in life, there's business and there's pleasure. So part of it's for pleasure. The food here is really nice. I'm accompanied by some of the most wonderful people I know, extended family of sorts. But there is also our mutual interest, which is very prevalent in Brazil, and it has a long history of this going all the way back to the 1950s. You probably know A.J. Javard, who I consider to be the best Brazilian ufologist. A.J. and I have had an opportunity to meet on a couple of occasions now. In fact, this is a synchronicity, Peter, but I didn't know when I was coming to Brazil for this leg of my world tour 2022 that there was going to be the 25th annual Brazilian Ufological Congress held 4 blocks away right here in Curitiba. And so I messaged AJ to say, hey, AJ, I'm going to be in town. Let's get together, have a coffee or a wine. And he says, even better, be my guest, come to the event, and love to see you there. And so we did attend. I got to meet him there, but then we caught up and had drinks afterward. And wonderful guy who would tell you. Yes, indeed. And he'll tell you, as many would who, appreciate the history of this topic. And again, I know I'm singing to the choir on that point with you. A man who has labored in the dungeons below the New York Times in search of historical information on this topic. Brazil has a rich history as well. It goes at least back to the 1950s. Their Air Force came out and acknowledged the prevalence of sightings and their unknown provenance as well. So long story short, I've been doing a little of both, enjoying the cuisine and the weather, and also catching up on the history of the UFO subject here.
You know, you remind me, not long after my obsession began with this subject, that thankfully at a certain point moderated into a very strong interest. Obsession does not necessarily serve us past a certain point. One of the first case files, so to say, that I came upon that I found so powerful, and this again is way pre-digital, pre-internet, basically Stone Age stuff, was that simple series of 2 photos taken in 1957 of a beautifully articulated UFO, disc shape, with not any ambiguity to it, passing over a Brazilian naval vessel, which happened to have its crew on the deck at the time. And over 800 individuals, military individuals, saw the object pass over. And it was photographed during the International Geophysical Year by, as I recall, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer. And it was just so exciting. This was before Freedom of Information Act even, to see that documentation. There is something about analog photographs. I'm a little nostalgic about it, but I mean, when you were looking at a fake, if you looked at it under a 10-power glass, you could often see the edge of the paper where the scissor had cut around. It's a little different now. Let's start at the beginning, Micah. Where were you born?
Well, I was born in a small town in the Appalachian Mountains. You may have visited there, but not when I was your host, and I hope you can come down and visit sometime. It's Asheville, North Carolina. The weather there is almost identical to how it is in Curitiba right now. Most people would think, oh, he's in Brazil, it must be really hot down there. You know, the beaches are full. Not necessarily. Indeed. You know, I'm probably closer to the southern end of the continent and thereby closer to Antarctica than I am to, for instance, where you are in New York. But that said, I was born in Asheville, and the weather there in the mountains of Appalachia is very similar to the fall season we're entering into in Curitiba. And the other thing that's wonderful about the mountains is that on any given night, especially out in the country where I grew up, Peter, you have an almost uncompromised view of the heavens. You know, you can see the stars, and then you can see the stars behind the stars, and so on and so on. And I decided years ago, of course, that in the tradition that many ufologists would follow, and I want to come back a little later on that note of ufologists. Many people are debating this UAP versus UFO thing. I'd like to get into that with you a little, because that always makes for some interesting conversation. But yeah, I bought a telescope several years ago and began, stepping up, in the words of the great Emeril Lagasse, kick it up a notch, really start looking at the heavens. The most anomalous thing I've ever seen while staring at the night sky through a telescope was what appeared to be a small bolide pass through my field of view, which many astronomers will tell you is pretty rare. Here's how much of the sky you can see with your naked eye, and you're looking through a pinhole to amplify as much of that space as possible at a great, tremendous distance, literally light years. It's far less likely that you're going to see those little meteors streaking through the sky. I've never seen what I would call a bona fide UFO. I've seen some curious things, lights in the sky that by definition they would be unidentified flying objects, but again, their provenance is in question. But long story short, that's where I'm from, and it obviously was a very influential place growing up with this view of the heavens. The last point I'll also add is that I was blessed to have a mother and a father still alive, still very interested. And my father gave me books. I asked for books, and they said, here's Mike, Mary, and Jeff. Here is the New Webster's Dictionary. Let's teach you how to talk. And I said, what about those strange things you see in the sky? And I thought I had my first UFO sighting in kindergarten. It turned out later that my parents saw the same light. It was just an aircraft of some kind. But the important thing to me, Peter, was that I had cognizance of the idea of unidentified aerial phenomena as early as 5 or 6 years old. So it's truly been a lifelong journey.
That's not standard. You grew up with siblings?
My brother Caleb, who you might have met Caleb on some occasion. I'm not sure. Caleb used to join me at some of the UFO events, and I hope maybe in the years ahead he will do that again because, like so many people, since 2017, it really has reinvigorated the debate to an extent. And my brother went from being a casual, kind of having a passive interest in the topic to now being really, really interested, and like so many other Americans and people around the world. But also back to an earlier point you made, Peter. I think I'm probably in that fanatic stage still. I haven't made it a manageable hobby yet. UFOs are still what I eat, live,
I was
breathe,
going to
sleep.
say.
Yes.
I can't say I have it as a manageable hobby, but it's not something that obsesses me 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Um, Tell us a bit about your parents. Did they both work? Did your mom stay at home? What did they do when you were
My
growing up?
mother, yes, my mother worked from home, which is a very important aspect of my formative period because she was always on hand, but she was also an income earner. My father was the main income earner, but he was self-employed and he taught music. He had a real estate license. He
Ah,
actually taught martial arts. And my
holy
father is
moly.
truly He's truly a Renaissance man, but again,
Yeah.
also a scholar who obtained his bachelor's in classics from the University of North Carolina at Asheville.
Wow.
Studied Latin, Greek, Hebrew, some Aramaic, different languages. And many
Oof.
years later, this was a late life career change because he was already maybe in his late 40s, early 50s when he decided to do this. But he became an Episcopal priest, which was, I mean, his experience with Latin, especially, but also Greek, it was very useful for that. And now his interest, he's retired from the priesthood, but now he has stepped into the next phase, which is he's become a Mason at the local lodge. Yes, yes. And he is, of course, rising very quickly in the ranks, continuing that interest. And that's very similar to how I am. My father is a student of life, but being self-employed and my mother being self-employed and working from home, I learned a very important lesson early on. If you want to be a full-time ufologist, you still got to find a way to pay the bills. And it
That's
helps
right.
if you have flexibility with that job and can take it with you anywhere you go. So I spent the last maybe 12 years building that kind of a profession as a freelance writer,
Yep.
podcaster, audio engineer, narrator, work that I can usually do almost anywhere, given certain parameters.
Yeah.
But it also allows a certain degree of time for the very important research that involves our
Yeah.
mutual interest.
You know, I don't know if I've ever had a guest who has said it better in terms of parental models of an ideal situation. And it doesn't have to do with money. It has to do with character, with intention, with a love of life, with knowing that the process of learning never stops. And if you ever
Yes.
hit a point where you think it does, you're still breathing, but you're waiting to die. And the car is stalled on a very dark road. I can't think of anything darker than, what some people call retirement and spending your days playing golf. Not that I demean anybody that plays golf. It looks like a perfectly enjoyable game, but and to keep reaching out, the idea of owning a telescope, um, I think for a lot of people, it simply ignites their imagination.
Mhm.
For billions of people, they live in congested areas. I lived most of my life in New York City and would still be there if the realtors hadn't kind of won the battle with me.
Right.
But it precludes really getting an opportunity to, see the sky in optimum terms, where Asheville or an area like I am that are basically pollution free and with a good open sky, your imagination just takes over. Um, when you were um, in elementary school, at a certain point, you mastered reading. We all get there at a different point, at different time, and sometimes several years apart. For you, once you really knew how to read, what were the first books that you gravitated toward, that were open to you, that you looked forward to or wanted to read about?
Well, it might not be difficult to guess. And by the way, when it comes to mastering reading or language of any kind, I wish I could learn Brazilian Portuguese as quickly as I was able to pick up the English language. Although, when you're a child, you're just a sponge and everything
It's
seems
true.
to go much more quickly. Really,
If
you've
only they
invested.
taught foreign language in schools starting in elementary school, which is very rare.
Yeah, although I did have some Spanish, which helps with the Portuguese because so I did
Yeah.
have a little of that. But to your question, yes, by the time I was in second grade, I think that's when I really have early memories of reading books about what I would call it Fortean phenomena. Ripley's Believe It or Not kind of, books that are,
Yes.
talking about just a wide range of anomalies in nature, not only UFOs, but I certainly began to look at books about that as well. Then we came to an impasse in third grade, Peter, because her dear soul, I appreciate the skepticism that she instilled in me at an early age, but my third grade teacher was a very science-minded person who not only wanted, again, looking out for my best interests in the best way that she knew how, she not only wanted to try to limit my access somewhat to UFO books and to encourage me to read more,
We all
science and
know
history.
it's delusional, and I just want to help you get through this phase that you're going through of this fascination with this fantasy. Pure ridicule.
Let's cut this off early on and steer him on the right path. That's what she
Interesting.
hopes to do. And it's interesting also because my parents eventually ended up meeting with her. They had the dreaded parent-teacher conference, and she sat down and said, I'm a little worried about what your son reads. My mother and dad retorted, but he's reading. And we're glad that our son, rather than playing Nintendo, rather than, going and doing whatever, all the other things he could be doing, which nothing wrong with Nintendo, but they were delighted that I had my nose in a book most of my childhood. But my teacher did prevail in some regards. She ended up reaching a compromise where she said, you may continue your UFO obsession. Third grade Micah Hanks. How old are you then? 8 years old, whatever. But she said every other week when you go to the library, you must check out some fiction, some literature.
That's not bad.
It's not. And again, that was incredibly formative too. So I was actually very thankful that she instilled in me a scientific approach. But there was an incident really that has remained with me, and I don't consider it a negative one per se. I wrote my first report on UFOs in third grade. It was a writing project. I investigated this. I wrote brief synopses of famous UFO cases and then talked about my own interest in everything. I didn't get a 100 on the project, and the reason had been that she said you'd get a perfect grade, but unfortunately, I think that the subject matter, there's not enough scientific evidence to support this. So what you wrote was well written, but I think that the subject matter was lacking for a science report. And she kind of stood me up in front of the class and said this, and I, put on a play. Peter, I drooped my shoulders, but what ended up happening? I remember as a kid thinking, I'll show her. And little did she know that through that kind of what you might call a fair-handed but negative reinforcement, I think she launched my ufological career right then and there. And I still have that report. I still have it archived. I have copies of that. And remarkably, in the research phases, I would see the teacher write in the margins on my notes. She would say, okay, this is good, but this is speculative. Let's see if we can find a reliable source for this information. But then this assistant teacher would come in the next week and she would write in the margins, have you ever watched the show Unsolved Mysteries? I saw a really incredible story about a light in the sky that some people saw. What do you think about that? And it's hilarious because, again, how is that any different from how you or I, are today, Peter? People write to you, dear Mr. Robbins, I listened to your program. I think I saw something I can't explain. I would really appreciate your knowledge and your insight on this. And I had my first experience, limited though it was, along those lines, both with the official skepticism trying to kind of knock down on me, and also someone saying, hey, what do you think this was? When I was in third grade. So I've basically been a UFO researcher my whole life.
I love it. One of my proudest early credits in the work was appearing on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries with Bud Hopkins when I worked as his assistant, this going back to the late 1980s. And thinking now, the influence that program had, and it was narrated by one of my favorite popular culture figures, Robert Stack, who I grew up with adoring as Elliot Ness in the Desilu production, a great television series, very good and gritty, and Law and Order. But thinking back on this third grade teacher, life can be so complex, and people can do the right thing for the wrong reason or the wrong thing for the right reason with an open heart and concern. And sometimes it produces the result that is counter to what they wanted in a tightly defined way. But in the big picture, if you could sit down with your third grade teacher again now, if she's still here or if she's not, and she could see what you've accomplished and what it is based on, I think she'd be very proud of you. In the world of film viewing, we as Americans, are movie-going public. Did you begin your film watching career basically watching movies on TV, or did your family go out to the local theater, or ultimately did you go with friends? How did that get kicked in?
That's a great question because I, like you, and you know this about me, we have a very sincere mutual appreciation for the arts. And my earliest film going experience, I think there were some other little cartoony kind of films my parents took me to, and they certainly took me to see the classic Peter Pan. And I appreciate the art of, for instance, Disney films, and some of them are just remarkable.
Yes.
But as far as my interest as a child, I just wasn't as drawn to that. They could tell, they take me to the theater. I'm just kind of like, sort of half-heartedly paying attention. Mom and Dad went to the theaters, though, on one occasion, and I think that the film that they went to see, which I got to stay at Grandma's this night, so Mom and Dad could have a date, right? They went and saw this film that was very intriguing sounding to me. It was called Return of the Jedi. And so, yes. So I told Mom and Dad, I said, I want to go see one of those movies. And so the next time a film like that came around, a LucasArts production, that they felt that I was, old enough to, mature enough to handle it for the most part, but they were still feeling like they were taking a bit of a risk.
Good for them.
Because they did try to be careful, Peter. They were trying to be good parents. But the film that they chose warily to take me to see was called Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Hooray!
Yes. And now that was a movie. And I was mad at Mom because at the end, spoiler alert, ladies and gents, those of you who haven't seen it, but, at the very end of the film where he grasps the wrong cup, you have chosen poorly, and, withers away into nothingness. My mother covered my eyes. She didn't want me to see all this, Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, Ma, come on!" But
you've made up for it since, I'm assuming.
Yes. Oh, certainly. Yes. It remains one of my favorite films and one of my most beloved memories, and for many reasons.
Yeah,
one, because I became very interested in archaeology a few years ago, real archaeology, what I consider to be, not like let's go hunt for, alien technologies and not to say that I'm dismissive of those things, but the area of archaeology that I focus in is actual archaeology, speaking with actual archaeologists as a layman or an avocationalist, visiting and actually volunteering on archaeological sites, learning lithic point types and the lithic point sequences of the southeastern United States, traveling to sites of indigenous American cultural heritage, writing about that, being an advocate for those issues. I'm very passionate about all those things. And here again, I can trace that interest in archaeology all the way back to going and seeing that film and saying, now that's what I want to do. I want to be Indiana Jones.
If I could turn my situation around here, you would see half a bookshelf of just archaeology books. It was something that captured my imagination as a boy, in that by the time I was 6, certainly possibly 5, my grandfather, my father's father, had taught me 2 extraordinary concepts that were life-changing. One was that history is a living thing. And the other was how you can deploy your imagination to live a richer, fuller, more exciting life. The way that he did it, and 5-year-old me and him are walking around Manhattan, probably fairly close, in fact, definitely fairly close to his apartment on Lexington and 26th, 27th. And I remember we were on 29th Street looking west from Broadway. And he said, I want you to, with your imagination, take away these buildings, pointing at newer buildings, and then replace them with other buildings that are more contemporary with these. Could do it. And all the people on the street, I want you to put them in the clothing that we've seen in the books or in the old, comedies that we watch without people talking. Got it. Take away all the cars except maybe a few of the most old kind of cars, a lot of horses, a lot of horse carts. Got it? He said, now squint your eyes. I would. He'd said, that's what this street looked like in 1900. Well, he might as well have said 1500. And I never have walked through a city the same way or an ancient area. You can look at a gargoyle from a certain angle, and if a plane isn't flying by, that exact same view, maybe with a slight discoloring gone, is what somebody saw X number of 100 years ago. I think it's wonderful that you're doing this. And it's kind of a drive mechanism, one thing to the next, of these are all exploring the unknown on a certain level and making it known for yourself and other people. And it's satisfying in both respects. Now, by the time that you're in high school, again, you have wonderful models with your parents, but did you, like a lot of young people, have your eye on a certain career that you should pursue in the adult world?
Yes. By the time I was in middle school, I had convinced myself that I wanted to go and be an artist for Marvel Comics. I wanted to be an illustrator, which is funny because my brother grew up to become one of the best illustrators that I know. Caleb is just a truly, truly talented individual. He can do comic art better than I ever thought I would be able to, let alone can actually do. But I took art very seriously and kind of thought that I would do something in the arts. And about I would say 10th or 11th grade, again, I was going through the library and I'd probably taken some time off. I think every young man goes through this kind of peer pressure thing where it's like, I need to wear these certain kinds of tennis shoes. I need to get involved in a sport and play a sport. And the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, I remember just saying, nah, grew my hair out, started wearing tie-dye, started playing the guitar very seriously, and also the violin, and just pursued the arts full bore. And I remember coming back from summer vacation and people were like, what are you thinking, man? What are you doing? You need a haircut. And I didn't cut my hair for the rest of the duration I was in high school. I just kept growing it and growing it and growing it. But about 10th or 11th grade, I was in the library one day and I actually rediscovered some of my childhood favorites, books by the writer Daniel Cohen, who actually was a skeptic, but he wrote what I thought were very good books that were very fair-minded about anomalous phenomena. He
including on the mystery airship wave of 1897, as I recall.
Yes, that, and of course, what was very popular in the 70s and 80s when he was writing these books, the Ancient Astronaut, as we would call it, Ancient Aliens today. Yeah. I read all those books, and I was fascinated by that. And then, of course, from there, the one that really, really was influential for me was Jerome Clark. Jerome Clark wrote those wonderful compendiums of Fortean phenomena, unexplained. A few years later, I would actually acquire a copy of the condensed version of his UFO encyclopedia, which, ladies and gents, hands down, yes, indeed. Now, do you have the one or the 2-volume set, Peter?
Well, when the 2-volume set came out, Bud Hopkins gave me his the first edition, and then later I acquired the second edition. Jerry is now working on edition number 4. In fact, he is an upcoming guest on this show and somebody who, like you, I hold in the highest regard. His books on the unknown, on the Fortean, on the cryptozoological, not to mention, I mean, when you take upon yourself to write an encyclopedia of a subject as vast as UFOs, it reminded me of the great Dr. Johnson, who in the 18th century decided he was going to write a dictionary of the English language. And some years ago, I paid a pilgrimage at his home where he grew up. And it was just wonderful to think of this mind processing this material. In fact, to go off on a tangent, one of the funniest British comedies in decades that came out at least 25, 30 years ago, Blackadder, with Rowan Atkinson. What can I say? It slays me. This last 3 seasons, they still just roll me on the floor. And there is one where another wonderful British actor, comedian, plays Dr. Johnson, and Atkinson's character keeps inventing new words that he drops into sentences and making this man just go crazy that he's got to write everything down. But Clark there's nobody like him in the work. There have actually been other books called the UFO Encyclopedia, but this is, in fact, maybe during the break I'll pull it out. It's a dangerous weapon. You can kill a human being or a good sized animal with it.
Yes, you can. I was delighted during a visit. I was dating a young woman who was going to school at the time at Appalachian State University, and she had an all-night research project she was working on and wanted me to come up to the library with her. Now, I didn't attend that college. I was merely visiting her while she was there. At the time, I probably was already working in radio, but I remember going and pouring through the reference section while she was studying, and lo and behold, I found the 2 volume set. Don't recall which edition, but right there in the reference section at Appalachian State University, which really, I'm very delighted anytime I go to any institute of higher learning, and they do have subject matter devoted to the UAP or UFO issue and other topics too. I have a terrible fondness for Fort and Fortiana. And again, on the subject of the airships, Peter, and what we might call historical ufology, this is really truly my favorite thing. Looking back, like Jan Aldrich and Barry Greenwood and so many other researchers have done over the years. Of course, Jacques Vallée and Chris Albeck with their Wonders in the Sky went even further back and did some fantastic historical research. Again, it's hard to, the line begins to blur sometimes between aerial phenomena that was unknown to ancient observers and what would qualify for being things like UFOs as you or I might envision them today. But it's still fascinating to look back at the history of humankind's interaction with things in the sky that they can't identify, which, as Vallée wrote wonderfully in Anatomy of a Phenomenon, he said, this is an age-old experience. And although we can't capture that UFO and bring it down into a laboratory, he said we can study the UFO sighting and the meaning of the sighting to the individual. That can be studied scientifically, and that is something that we can look at all throughout history.
I'm going to jump subjects here. You grew up in a part of the United States with a very rich, very unique musical cultural history, going back to the first white settlers and to enslaved people in a kind of fusion. And it's English, Scottish, Irish, and African to a degree, separate and together. And Asheville, of course, is one of the great, maybe lesser appreciated, but amazingly central music centers in America, and a center of a certain kind of regional music. Like, I'm guessing just about every person that you grew up with the pop music of the time, the things that the next generation calls the oldies, that makes the older people feel like oldies. And at the same time, this unique folk tradition. When you said before that you played violin, I wondered if you played fiddle as well, or with the same instrument, not to mention guitar. Tell me about some of your earliest memories, because I know you're a musician, and it's a love that we share, about your introduction, your first take on the music of the region, if you will.
Sure. Yeah. Asheville, where I am, and really all throughout the Southeast, is known for its folk music. There's a particular style of music that I specialize in, which is a Appalachian regional style of music. Well, really, I guess actually it's not. I wouldn't say it's exclusive to Appalachia, but it has its roots there in many ways, and that is called bluegrass. The long story short, another of the things that my father did when I was a child, he was a great guitarist, a great banjo player. He plays fiddle. I play violin. I was classically trained as a violinist.
Ah, wonderful.
Never was able to get a feel quite for the fiddle like my dad does, and he could play all these other instruments as well. But he played in a bluegrass band that would go up to the actual Bob Evans farm, just like, what you see in the grocery stores, when you buy the sausage. We would go up to the Bob Evans farm bluegrass festival. every year. It was about a 9-hour drive, which to me felt like an eternity.
Yeah.
But my parents would put in a request to my teachers to allow Micah to have a Friday off so we could drive all day Friday, be there Friday night, and be there all weekend, be home Sunday night by, time for school again Monday. And I remember going and seeing those bluegrass bands and thinking, oh man, this is so cool. I want to learn how to play banjo like my dad. So he handed me a banjo at some point, and I was like, what is this? And he says, let's try again. All right. So then he hands me a guitar, but the problem is my hand was too small at that time to fit around the neck. So he says, let's wait a couple of years. About second grade again, as my interest in UFOs was beginning to bud and emerge, which there may be some more continuity there than some would think. That's about the same time I began to get really serious about music. And I've often hypothesized, Peter, this is purely speculation, but there are some scientific studies that suggest that certain faculties of the brain grow in tandem with musical fluency, and same with languages as well. And musicians tend to be a little more open-minded. They may tend to, have a interest in the arts, but that does not preclude an interest in the sciences. Long story short, what I'm saying is it seems to be a good place where you have a mindset that is not extreme and polarized. You tend to be very open to things. And I always have throughout my entire life. I can sit down with skeptics and have a serious conversation about, well, all the problems with this famous case. But then I can sit down with a quote unquote believer, and I prefer the term advocate because, again, there's more to the advocacy of genuine anomalous aerial phenomena than just I believe. Anyway, all that said, not to get lost in the weeds, coming back to music, I do think that plays a role in the formation of one's attitudes about certain things. It wasn't, however, until, probably in my early 20s that I really started learning that traditional style of music. Before that, I went through my rock and roll phase. I had a Fender Stratocaster, and boy, I bought every Jimi Hendrix album I could find. Yeah. And I, unlike all my kids at school, all my peers, they were all into, again, like you said, the pop music of that day. They listened only to what was on the radio. Very few of them listened to what mom and dad used to listen to when they were kids. And I was in that bunch. I was like, give me the Eric Clapton, give me the Jimi Hendrix, give me the Pink Floyd, give me the Doors. But then eventually I started catching up with some of my peers, learning some of the modern music styles. And then I just went about face and started studying jazz, blues, went all the way back to the Delta blues.
Yep.
I was 21 years old when I went through a breakup with a girl. And I was like, gosh, what am I going to do now? And then I found an album that changed my life, and that was called Manzanita by Tony Rice. And then I realized, okay, bluegrass music isn't just country music. Bluegrass is, and affectionately I refer to it as hillbilly jazz. Yeah. And I don't think anyone did that better than Tony Rice.
Like that. Yeah.
Yeah, although he called it space grass, by the way. That was, Tony's own term that he, Sam Bush, and other instrumentalists, and of course Tony also sang. So does Sam, but they were best known probably for their prowess as instrumentalists on the acoustic guitar, the mandolin. And so as I was going through that breakup, I started listening to this album and thinking, I have to learn this, and I began studying what you'd call flat picking. And really one of the earliest progenitors of melodic flat-picking acoustic music in this region, going back to Appalachian State University and the town of Boone, North Carolina, we had Doc Watson, a true national treasure, who I had the pleasure of being able to meet one time. I drove up to App State University one night with David Holt, who, thank goodness, he asked me to skip class. I was in college at a community college at the time, and David called me and said, you want to drive with me to Boone? I don't feel like making the drive by myself. And I said, sure, what's going on? He says, Doc might be there. And he knew full well that Doc was going to be there. And he took me along just to be able to have that experience. So I really appreciate David and, people like my father introducing me to those things. Another reason being that in the summertime, on any given Friday or Saturday night at barbecues throughout North Carolina and other places, you may see Micah Hanks performing some of those very same songs. It's also become a bit of a profession for me, Peter.
That's great. That's great. I think, again, for people in our field, you are facing a subject that is so all-encompassing, so life-changing, so paradigm-shifting, so central to, in part, why we're here and the biggest questions we can ask ourselves. And it's not uncommon to become obsessed with it, even to the point of letting other things in your life take second shift. For the years I worked on Left at East Gate, for example, 9 years to work on one book, a lot of other things slipped away, and I regret that. Also, I like to think I have a very good sense of humor and I'm a fairly well-rounded person, but it started to
Yes.
wear at the edges. And I realize now, for years, I am always reading at least two books at one time, often more. One book almost always in the trade, so to say. The newest, or a book by a colleague, or one to challenge my thinking in the area of unknown phenomena or UFOs, the other for pure entertainment. And in that sense, the self-isolation of the pandemic served me in a way that I would never have imagined. I read or reread dozens of great pieces of classic American literature and other literature translated, um, went through different sort of jags the same way other people, although I'm guilty of that too, of watching in this golden age of television again, the brilliant series that are being thrown at us from around the world. Um, I read a lot of espionage fiction in the 80s. Uh, John le Carré is one of my writing gods. I think he is just a brilliant writer. And it sort of kicked in again this winter. And I'm sure I read 15 or so World War II and Cold War and post-Cold War espionage novels to kind of just balance out the UFO-related reading that I was doing. I again want to shift our subject a little bit right now. Right now, we are in the middle of a remarkable time in our field that 5 or 6 years ago, I don't think either one of us would have imagined or fully anticipated. Whether or not one can argue that Blumenthal and Kane and Helen, I forget the name of the third writer on the two seminal articles in the December 2017 New York Times that kind of signaled the change, whether they were responsible for it or they just were the bellwether that marked it when it happened. We're seeing a extraordinary reduction in the culture of UFO-related ridicule. It took me about a year to realize that it had changed. I just thought it was a passing trend and waited for the other shoe to drop and, all the news readers to come back, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, all the facial gestures, all of the bantering with the newsman about, well, you've done, all the bullshit that they go through. And that now it's reflected very much in the media. You can get serious takes on the subject on Fox or on CNBC. In our Congress, it's doubly fascinating to see ideological enemies, people at different ends of the political spectrum. And I would use as examples, as a representative of the right, Marco Rubio, a senator from Florida, and one of my senators, Kirsten Gillibrand, who are shoulder to shoulder in crash courses and learning the basics of what's going on and amping up their knowledge. Also, I think cutting a path for other elected officials to realize I can express a serious opinion on this now and not have my career at risk, which was the way it always was. Your thoughts on this transition and how you feel it may be moving us into the future in this crazy, increasingly crazy world.
Yeah. Crazy is another statement, my friend. But the sea change that we have seen since 2017, I view as, in terms of that expression, past as prologue. And I've always acknowledged this cyclical periodicity to events throughout history. If we go back to the 1960s and we had people in the state of Michigan saying that they were seeing objects they couldn't identify. And Project Blue Book, which was still in business at that time, there would be for at least another 3 years. They sent their diligent astronomer, J. Allen Hynek, to go and to speak on this point about what Michiganians, some in law enforcement, some civilians, college students, people from all different walks of life were seeing. And Hynek, not having had enough time really to formulate what he wanted to say, but was essentially being pressured into get out there and say something. You know where this goes, yeah. And this is a infamous story in the history of this topic, but
sure.
He said it's possible that they were seeing swamp gas. Now, I bring that up because if you recall what the response to that, again, a guy who would go on to become one of the leading advocates of the last century, of all time, in fact,
the
for the
highest
serious
visibility person in the work for a number of years. You bet.
for a number of years, and even still today, Peter, in many
Yes,
ways.
very
But
much so.
because he misstepped, on that one point, the result wasn't just castigation from the, members of, for instance, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial
Yes.
Phenomena, NICAP, and being the most prevalent civilian UFO investigative organization out of Washington,
That's right.
anywhere really at that time, but they were based in the Capitol. But this also attracted the attention of a young congressman by the name of Gerald Ford. And Gerald took personal exception with a scientist coming and telling Michiganians what they think they saw. And he said it has to be taken to the highest level. I want to, see hearings on this because my constituents take it very seriously. Now, during that time, as you know, and I know too, because I still am a subscriber to the New York Times as a paper of record. The old gray lady, is an excellent resource for historical information on this. It's easy for me. You had to do the hard work, Peter. You went and you had to sit there and go through the archives. I really respect guys like you and, so many others who have done, Dr. Eddie Bullard did the same thing with a lot of the airship reports.
One of the great folklorists, you bet.
Incredible. But, again, when I log on to the Times Machine, as it's called, as a subscriber, digital subscriber, you can go and you can do a keyword search, right? They make it very easy, and you can read all those UFO articles, which once 2017 happened, I went back and I reread those, and I saw, well, this isn't entirely new. There have been in decades past instances where there was very serious, credible reporting on this issue. But the Air Force also was put under a lot of heat, and they essentially began looking for their exit route at that point, which led, of course, to the University of Colorado project under Edward U. Condon, and eventually the closure of Project Blue Book. Now, at that point, if you read in the New York Times, again, UFO reporting drops off for a couple of years. The tragic death of Dr. Gordon MacDonald is reported. That made the headlines. James, I'm so sorry. Yes, I say Gordon. Yes, James MacDonald. Thank you. Yes, Dr. James MacDonald.
One of our heroes for sure.
Well, again, a real firebrand who was at times even antagonistic toward Hynek.
That's right.
Which, for some fascinating commentary on that, read Jacques Vallée's Forbidden Science journals from over the years. But again, what you see, with the exception of Dr. James MacDonald's passing tragically as a result of suicide, and I see him as one of the real first early casualties of the ridicule factor in that regard. They reported on his death, but the UFO subject didn't continue to see much reporting. For many years, it kind of became a taboo. Oh, the scientists now know that there's nothing really to that. And you see those brief resurfaces of interest in the topic, maybe in the 80s, with the publication of books like Intruders by Bud Hopkins, Communion by Whitley Strieber. In the 1990s, when the U.S. Air Force was essentially, yet again, by congressional effort, pushed back into having to reopen the Roswell files. And then they put together their report, which I have very mixed feelings about the Air Force's official report and some of the inconsistencies in their interpretation of what really happened. But that's a conversation for another time. The point is, you do see a cycle every, decade or so, maybe, where there'll be a brief period of interest. So what's different? That's the approach I take now about since 2017. Has anything changed in terms of how we looked at it in the past? I think that the most significant difference is actually on the technological front, because with the groundbreaking reporting by Helene Cooper, Leslie Kean, and Ralph Blumenthal in 2017, and then the follow-up, of course, in 2019, which discussed the USS Theodore Roosevelt incidents. Ryan Graves became a household name, and he and his squadron mates, they are speaking very bluntly about these things would be out there all day. We saw them literally almost every day. How did they see them? Well, they were equipped with new, highly sophisticated Raytheon radar systems, which are called phased array radars, instead of like an old mechanical point radar. These essentially are able to, scan a wider area almost simultaneously. I'm no expert on this, but again, if you'd like to read more about that kind of technology, Ty Rogaway over at the War Zone and my colleague Brett Tingley have done some great reporting on that. But they also were equipped with this new targeting pod, the ATFLIR forward targeting infrared pod. These two technologies were game changers. Historically speaking, to me, Peter, only comparable to the introduction of radar during the Second World War. And as a student of this phenomenon, with all respect to our dear and departed colleague, Stanton Friedman, Stanton, was often of an opinion the phenomenon begins in the 1940s because after the bombs were dropped, they were coming down to Earth to check in on us. Well, but what about the Foo Fighters? What about some of the earlier historical accounts? My opinion is people were seeing UFOs before the war, decades beforehand. Whatever those airships were in the
millennia
1890s.
beforehand.
Yeah, those were very likely something anomalous as well. But people didn't have the instrumentation to be able to corroborate those eyewitness sightings. And it stopped being hearsay after the Second World War when we had radar systems that were, hey, I see a light, but I've got it on radar too. There's actually something there. So it was comparable. And since 2017, with the New York Times getting back into the game, thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Ralph and Helene Cooper. I have profound appreciation for people who took that risk. Yes. And who went to that length to try and make a story, not to make a story, but to report on a very valid story and an important one. Not only had the Department of Defense been saying, we no longer look at this issue back in the early 2000s, we now know, there was a DIA program, which of course is the Defense Intelligence Agency, a combat support agency of the DoD, that was looking at UFOs, no question there. Again, refer to James Lukatsky, George Knapp, and Colm Kelleher's book for a brief history on that topic. So long story short, Peter, to me what has changed is we are now equipped with new technologies, and for maybe the first time since the 1940s, we're getting a clearer perspective on a phenomenon that I think has been here all along, but it's harder for the media to ignore that because of those technological developments. And now it's game on. Now congressmen and senators are getting into the game and saying, whoa, what are we doing about this? And how do we deal with this going forward?
It's an extraordinary moment in that sense, almost a BC and AD, if you will, in the work. We have a little less than 5 minutes before we go to break. And one thing that I want to get into when we get back is the multiplicity of what this phenomena is all about. I think, like biblical scholars arguing over the meaning of an ancient Hebrew term, people in our field increasingly get in each other's faces over what it is. It's got to be this or it's got to be that, when my feelings over the decades have come to feel we're dealing with a myriad of phenomena, beings, dimensional creatures, or it's very Valian, it's very Keelian, if you will, and it's also hard metal machines of undetermined origin from places unknown and under intelligent control. I know when I started out in this work, I thought very simplistically, it's spacemen from another planet, which now is almost the most charming, entry-level, dismissed possibility among the newer vanguard of researchers. In part, it seems so passé when there is so much more exotic possibilities, and now with where everybody grabs onto a little piece of theoretical physics and speaks like they actually know what they're talking about.
Well said.
Is a lot of just sound machine going on the internet, which is possibly the greatest double-edged sword in the history of the human intellect. We could probably spend a week of seminars just talking about how that happened. I think about it too much, and I feel a penny explode in my fuse box, so to say. 10 years ago, I started to really wonder if this work was going to proceed, because I didn't see a newer generation of researchers, investigators, writers emerging. Now, I think it's such an incredibly healthy field. Potentially, there are so many good minds coming up into it. And again, without that fear of ridicule, it's a little like, I remember in the late 60s when the very first university offered a credit course in band management for rock and roll bands and,
Yes.
Associated bookkeeping. It was like, yay, the counterculture, we are here. And I, as one of those idealistic people who have actually attempted to make my living in this work for too long, I would advise anybody that is interested in doing what we do, to keep your damn day job and then do what we're attempting to do. Your thoughts as we head toward break on that?
Oh, yes. All points well taken. And, I spoke recently with Dr. John B. Alexander.
Yes.
Having read similar thoughts that he expressed in his book many years ago, UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, which I, by the way, think is a very good book. And our colleague Rich Dolan was the very one who said, Micah, you should read that. You really should. And so taking a cue from Rich, I read it. I hope to see Dr. Alexander, in fact, in the weeks ahead at the SCU conference that's going to be held in Alabama. SCU, for anyone wondering, is the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, a group of which I am a member, a contributing member. And that reason being, much to what you were discussing, because I do think it's important that we apply science to this issue and that we have a younger generation of people who are involved in it. But when I talked with John the other day, I mentioned to him that I read his book and found it profoundly influential, to which he joked, well, I'm glad you've got a day job. And exactly, yes.
I'm going to have to cut you off for a moment. I only wish I could be at that conference. This is a terribly important organization doing vanguard work. Please take notes, if you will. I would love to have you back in part just to share about that. This is Peter Robbins with my very special guest, Micah Hanks, on Meanwhile Here on Earth. We will be back in a matter of minutes. Don't go away.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Scrolling all day, time can disappear. Wanna make it count, why not volunteer?
Posting pics of your food, that takes up time. Time, you got time to binge all of season 9, though it got so bad.
Time, you got time. We're gonna grow back and be the same browse you had.
Just a few hours to keep families from harm. Help us end home fires with Sound the Alarm.
Volunteer for a day to install free smoke alarms in your community.
Discover the Observation Deck, a one-of-a-kind virtual event platform that takes video conferencing to the next level by using avatars to navigate a campus. There's so many areas and activities to choose from. There's a 1,000-seat auditorium, an expo hall, a nightclub, and even a beach. So come attend a conference, take a class, or hear a lecture on the incredible Observation Deck campus. Go to theobservationdk.com.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected. Only at kgradb.com.
And we are back, Meanwhile Here on Earth, with my special guest, Micah Hanks. Visit his website, micahhanks.com, MICAHHANKS.com. Micah, when you first started to become involved in the subject as a young boy, did you immediately assume it was spacemen from another planet, or was your mind working beyond that already at that point?
That also a very good question. I think that, really almost everyone who looks at this topic at some point entertains first the idea that, oh, UFOs, spaceships, and thereby piloted by spacemen. But
And hopefully some space women too.
we would hope, hey, you know what? Space anything they want to be, right? I have no problems. But in fact, they may not even be necessarily man or woman as we know it. But this is, I think, where the conversation sort of starts to begin to unfold, because anyone who seriously looks at this begins to start looking at problems associated with, for instance, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which, by the way, let me be very clear, I don't rule that out of hand by any means. And in fact, in recent years, I've come back around to the way I describe it for folks, Peter, is that I have separate partitions on my hard drive with different operating systems.
Yes.
And
well said.
And I think it's important to be able to, for instance, analyze this subject in the context of, well, if they were extraterrestrial, what would be the best indications of that reality based on information that we've seen in recent years, and of course the data that we've collected now for many decades. But like you said, I love that you use the expression Keelian, because I too say Keelian in reference to the late great John A. Keel, Jacques Vallée, who is still with us and who is arguably one of the most influential living ufologists, having apart from yourself, of course, but having lived, though, during that period we were discussing before the break, with Dr. James McDonald getting into the effort to push scientists and push politicians to look at this seriously, challenging the skeptical science contingency, best represented, etc. Vallée, he was a young man, but he was right there in the middle of all that. And even before J. Allen Hynek began to author popular books on this subject, one of the earliest pro-UFO books written by a scientist was Vallée's Anatomy of a Phenomenon.
That's right.
Which is still a very worthwhile read. Now, yes, there are going to be some newspaper reports from, early times that were later proven not to have been accurate. And, Vallée's acknowledged that, back in the 60s, before we had the internet, search engines, newspaper archive websites, ease of accessibility to historical information like every Tom, Dick, and Harry can do these days, and do it from their computer, or better yet, their smartphone. Yeah, there were limitations to research. So, for the time that it was written, I think that book is and remains an exemplary statement on this phenomenon. And at that time, Vallée was also essentially kind of approaching this from the perspective of, and probably extraterrestrial is the best of the working hypotheses we have. But then within a few years, actually right about 1966, when John Keel got into it, he said, I'm going to figure this out, and I'm going to write the best article on UFOs ever written. I think it was published in Playboy magazine, if memory serves. And John had an admirable approach, because Keel said, I'm going to throw out all the presuppositions about spacemen, and I'm just going to look at the reports. Very similar to how Vallée approached it. And I've noticed over the years, reading both of those men's books, that, they often reference each other's work. And that being because they both began to, through different approaches, come to similar conclusions, or maybe the lack thereof, about what this phenomenon might represent. And Vallée began to really feel like, the proliferation of sightings are far too great to account for just a simple survey of Earth by a single intelligent species. How they would get here and traverse that distance if they are biological, that's an issue. But then again, Vallée, even as early as at least the 60s, I recall reading in his notes him saying that maybe these things are artificially intelligent beings, maybe they're biomechanical, or maybe they're just completely automatic. They're just robots, for lack of a better term. Yeah. Point is that you start seeing out of these analyses by guys like Keel and Vallée that there are problems with accounting for the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And for a time, I kind of went deep and just thought, I reject the extraterrestrial idea, and I'm going to work with alternatives. And, favorites were, of course, the possible, thread in, linking time travel, time travelers from the future. This might account why some of the purported UFO occupants resemble humans, slightly different, but nonetheless close. I thought about, for instance, the idea that if we live in a simulated reality, maybe when the actual operators of the simulation interface with our reality, that's how a UFO sighting appears to us within the Matrix. And that film, by the way, That film, was highly influential in that regard and really opening people's minds to possibilities about how real is reality itself. And if we aren't so sure about that, where exactly do these UFOs fit into that grand scheme? But again, in recent years, it's not that I've come back around and just accepted wholeheartedly the ET hypothesis. What I have done is I've entertained more ways that could perhaps be rectified. For instance, how do you overcome travel from distant star systems? Well, first of all, if you sent the primary craft here a long time ago, but they were already in a highly advanced civilization, and what we have here on Earth that represents that technology is essentially, artificial intelligence, and they've been here for a long time. We don't have to worry about them getting here shortly after us dropping nuclear bombs. The UFO presence may have been here for much longer, and we're still not certain what it is, but it very well could have been something extraterrestrial. Final point. A lot of astronomers have made a very interesting point about the idea of ancient extraterrestrial visitation and why it's more likely in the ancient past. There are a lot of interesting, rationales for this. And of course, Carl Sagan was one of the earliest champions of that idea. But the notion that if we are living in an ever expanding universe, i.e. your Big Bang Theory, long ago, billions of years ago, let's say, if there were conditions that allowed a intelligent civilization to rise to, technological sophistication long ago, which is not impossible, perhaps at a time in the universe when distances between galaxies, etc., were closer together at that, earlier stage in the expansion period, perhaps travel from one, location in the universe to another would have been easier. It might have been more easy. So there are some astronomers who say we aren't all in on the UAP that we observe today and that our military studies being extraterrestrial, but we don't rule out the possibility that long ago, when it might have been easier for them to get here, that visitors did come to Earth. So that's an interesting take on it, but just one of many ways that I think we can, in some ways, sort of vindicate the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But again, to your point, I don't give myself to any single hypothesis. I acknowledge them all, and I try to group what I observe in terms of data in the best fit for a given scenario, if that makes sense.
I think that's about as healthy an attitude as you can have. And for me, the best model regarding the ETH is one basically set forward by, again, the late, great Stanton Terry Friedman, which is, and I'm paraphrasing ever so slightly, the question is not, are all UFOs representative of advanced technology in the form of metallic machinery under intelligent control from parts unknown? The question is, has one ever been? And the answer to that seems to be an overwhelming yes. We're at a moment right now in the history of focused UFO studies, of the people involved, and we have not even mentioned the people who experience these things, the people who, some may debate or assign an assortment of psychological conditioning or what have you, but I am convinced beyond any reasonable doubt, from focused years in the work and having met with hundreds of people over the years who have been taken, brought aboard or brought to another environment, and then returned. The importance of these people in evaluating a fuller picture of the work. One thing that Bud Hopkins instilled in me was a sense that even if the highest intentions are involved by those taking, and we're not talking here about a myriad of intelligences or interdimensional phenomena, we're talking very likely a select number. The one that comes to mind the most are the face of them is the Greys, who are probably laboratory manufactured and who are kind of like bees or ants in terms of acting in a very collective, dispassionate sort of manner. But that deception weaves its way through this phenomena. I think even Vallée, Keel, the folks who veer away from extraterrestrial hypothesis, that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on around here. And it's not something that we humans are unfamiliar with. It seems to be innate to intelligent organisms that sometimes you must practice a certain amount of deception to produce a positive result, or at least a result that seems positive to you. A question that I see asked all too often over the decades is, are they good or are they bad? Wrong question to ask. It's like this model. You and I, instead of ending up in the field that we're in, we're biologists interested in certain species of mammals, and we got into research on otters, because who doesn't love otters? And we've been dropped into some place up by Hudson's Bay. There's this endangered species of amazing otters, and we need to figure out what's going on with them. We've got our supplies. We're going to be picked up by a helicopter in a week or what have you. We've got our base camp. We set up our painless traps, and we go check them the next morning. And what do you know? We got an otter. Now, we love these critters. And I open the cage, you lift it out, you hold it. It's like if you're a cat person, any cat will do pretty much. And, you're telling it that you love it. We won't hurt it. We're just trying to help it. Meanwhile, I'm giving it an injection of something that'll keep it from getting some otter disease. I am then putting a radio collar around its neck. I'm spray painting a number on its side. It is freaking out. It has never encountered giant hairless otters like us. It is having the biggest crisis of its life. It is terrified. It doesn't matter what our intentions are. Then it wanders back into Otterland and says, "You're never going to believe what happened to me." They say, "Whatever it is, keep away from us. Something has happened to you and we can see it." It's the thing of perception and reality. But we can be doing something, you give a child an injection to keep from getting polio. And all the child knows is that this hurts a lot, and that is a needle, and I don't want you to stick it in me, and I hate you for doing it. We're at a moment right now where there are two extraordinarily active factions in the work. And one is very much based in the experiencer community, the other in, let's call it, the pragmatic community. Louis Elizondo, Mellon, Avi Loeb. These are establishment figures that have woken up to something is going on here. It's important. We need to get to the bottom of it and establish some parameters here, cut through some of the secret keeping, and share what we have with the general public. The other is centered around good people, like Hernandez. I'm blanking.
Ray Hernandez?
Ray Hernandez, of course, who with Free is doing some extraordinary work and very well documented. I think they're coming into their third huge New York, when there was a New York City phone book size volume of accounts of experiencers that are overall very positive and transcendently so. And there is this feeling on the part of one camp, and I'm generalizing here to a great degree, but it's still in the realm, that what you're doing is wrong. You're looking at them as a potential threat. We need to get over our fear. We need to transcend it. We need to embrace this reality. We need to take a chance, or we're going to lose our chance. We must get through this Neanderthal sensibility that everything is a threat, and that it's about love, and it's about connection, and it's about graduating and growing up, where the other faction is reminiscent, at the baseline of one of my all-time favorite classic Twilight Zone episodes. It's a cookbook. And
yeah.
Again, we're dealing with very different factions here, both making very good points. And just to complete a thought here, when I began working with Bud Hopkins in earnest in the mid-1980s, and then when Intruders came out, this almost within the same moment, that Whitley Strieber's Communion and Timothy Good's Above Top Secret came out. Extraordinary year for publishing in this field. The folks that were coming to Bud overall, and it wasn't that he was seeking them out, were to one degree or another traumatized by what had happened to them. I think part of the reason for that, looking back with some cultural perspective here, is that in popular culture itself, there were very few models for establishing that this is happening to many people. You're not alone. You're always brought back, so to say. Whatever it is, you can get through it. You can still have your dreams. You can fall in love. You can start a business. You can have happy kids. But I'd say about 2/3, and nobody kept tight statistics on this, of the reports were, I didn't have a good time. And I say this also with the special consideration that I attended almost every early support group meeting that Bud held in my capacity as his assistant, and to a degree because my sister, who was an abductee, it was kind of carte blanche. It came along with it. Now I'd say from the statistics that we're seeing coming out of Free, the statistic is the other way. It seems more and more like 2/3 of experiences are reporting positive experiences. Now, again, this is a very subjective matter, and we are dealing with these two seemingly opposing forces. This is a very complex situation in terms of human tensions and also in terms of who are they, what are they about? Is it they who have changed their modus operandi, we who have changed our perspective, different groups involved? Jump into this ridiculously poorly phrased question. Your thoughts? Your thoughts on that, Micah?
Not poorly phrased at all. No, I think all very important points because, the otter. Let's see. I think we may have a slight connection lag, but hopefully it'll pick up here in a moment. The otter analogy that you gave really just hits the nail on the head, because in this capacity, you're seeing a snapshot, and you could apply that to any animal life on Earth, how we study those animals and what it must seem like to them. Now, again, most biologists would say, yeah, but they aren't, their brain function and their evolutionary path in terms of how they function as organisms is vastly different from us. They probably aren't thinking, they aren't rationalizing. They can be stressed out, but tomorrow we put that collar on this otter or whatever else and it'll be fine. Humans are very different. We do try to rationalize these kind of situations, and I can only imagine what it must be like for one of the experiencers who says that they have had this happen to them. Again, one of the best known is Travis Walton, dear friend of both of us. Travis, though, fascinates me because his account has changed from in the 1970s when the story first broke and it was described or phrased as a abduction. And as you know, Travis now says it was more like a rescue operation. Like I ran out under this thing like discharged. I was knocked back. I probably would have died laying out there, and my buddies thought I was dead. It was obvious that they saved my life. Trying to, apply human logic to all of these experiences of the experiencers, there's obviously a significant gap in understanding. But on the same token, to bring up another historical perspective on this, back in the 1960s, again, there was a time where the NICAP organization was very, very cautious about ever entertaining the stories of humanoid occupants and sightings of the UFO-nauts, as they were called.
Yeah. Yes.
And the reason being that, well, we're studying this tangible, real phenomenon, but as soon as, we start getting into I saw who was flying that thing, it starts to sound too incredible. To which I look back historically and think to myself, well, and if you're studying this phenomenon, and you perceive these as being, controlled vehicles, intelligently controlled vehicles, why does it sound so crazy to suppose that there are occupants on board these things, some of them piloting these craft? Now, recently on my podcast, I did an episode that I just titled The Humanoids, because this borrowed from a very eerie story of a man who in the 1970s called Robert Gribble at the National UFO Reporting Center. And he had been coming back from a basketball game in Utah, if memory serves. And he saw this light, and he pulls over to the side of the road, stops his vehicle, and he sees this landed craft and these two men. And as he begins to approach them to see exactly what he's looking at, he says he hears a voice, but the voice wasn't necessarily audible. It was more like it was projected, and it said, "Do not be afraid. We're just scientists, basically. We're just studying." But then he was blasted with a little beam of light. Didn't seem to harm him, but when he got home, he noticed on his abdomen that there was he said, like a Big Dipper, type of, not abrasions, just marks that were left on his torso. And the recording of the audio that he provided to Robert Gribble is really interesting, because he calls back several times that night, very concerned, wanting to know if there's anybody who can help him. Gribble's trying to put him in touch, I believe, with APRO, would have been the organization at the time. And this man says at one point, he said, "I just want to know, did they mark me because they might be coming back sometime? I don't want to be a marked man. I saw people that aren't people. I just call them humanoids." But again, I listened to the things going through his mind. That wasn't even an abduction per se. It was merely a close encounter. But the way that he tried to rationalize it, and yes, there was an apparent physiological effect on that witness, if that story is to be believed, and it sounds very credible to me.
Yeah.
There are dimensions of all this that we have yet to fully understand. That, Peter, or maybe it is just as simple as it sounds. These are highly advanced visitors, scientists, who are dropping down, and they're doing whatever studies it is that they're doing. And from time to time, people see them. But there are an awful lot of reports of people who say that they've seen these things. So I'd like to see, as NICAP did in the 1960s, the modern UFO dialogue move into a direction where people can acknowledge several decades of credible accounts involving eyewitness, observation of reported, sometimes mostly humanoids, I would say, but not always. But nonetheless, what they took to be the occupants of these craft, whether it's an abduction or merely a landing, and there was an observation, audible phenomena associated with that, we need to take those reports seriously. If we don't, we are leaving out a potentially very significant portion of the broad spectrum of data that we have about this phenomenon.
Very well stated. You reminded me of something. Again, I became involved in this subject in the later 70s. And at the time, within the greater, we'll call it the UFO community, which was overwhelmingly middle-aged white guys who wanted to be taken seriously. There was little, if any, discussion of the humanoids or even Betty and Barney Hill. It was considered an awkward moment in that if you want to be taken seriously in a subject that is considered so outside the realm, so non-standard, such an outsider subject, as David Jacobs once said to me, describing that time, we were focused on the cars and not the drivers. We knew to a degree that these things were under intelligent control, but when you cross that line, knowing that there's a world of skeptics and debunkers waiting to pounce on you. Oh, well, you're talking now about little green men in the flying saucers. The dialogue ceases. And I guess we've all grown up enough to know that for whatever aspect of the UFO phenomena is represented by advanced technology and beings of undetermined origin, yes, under intelligent control is obviously what's going on here. To shift the subject a bit, on a seminal UFO case that, and you may be able to perceive me, but you've gone off camera, and we can edit this. If you can hear me, look at the camera icon and see if there's a line through it. Okay, we'll hold that thought for a moment. Yep, I think so. Up, here he comes.
Sorry about that.
And he's back. To shift the dialogue slightly to a case that for many people is a holy grail, the Big Bang in ufology, or that is completely misunderstood and is explainable in conventional terms of a sort, Roswell. Um, do you have any definitive thoughts about the authenticity of Roswell and whether or not it was a crash of a truly anomalous object under intelligent control, or more theories and ideas laid out by, among other people, friend and colleague Nick Redfern, in terms of mastering German technology, using a human being with, I forget the name of the very terrible condition with the enlarged skull and the advanced age, but this tragic crash of trying something out. Do you have any strong, as we come into, and we're, as this show is broadcast in May, we are right around the corner from the 75th anniversary of the most famous UFO case in the world. Your thoughts?
Well, Roswell has always been problematic in the sense that there was the newspaper report. There were so many witnesses who said that they recalled what they saw, and that they experienced what they experienced. Many UFO researchers over the years have, seen that as the smoking gun, because this was probably the first high-profile military encounter that seemed like it was going to break open what, again, your friend and mine, Stephen Bassett, refers to as the so-called truth embargo. I've always enjoyed that expression. But over the years, part of the problem, I guess, with Roswell, and I call it the Roswell paradox, is the fact that we have multiple different accounts. And if you recall, and you probably, as well or better than most will recall, in the 1990s, there was a bit of a schism in ufology. Now, granted, I was very young, but I had my copy on the trip to Ohio, right, to go and see my father perform. I had my copy of the UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin Randall and Donald R. Schmidt. And so that was also some of the early reading material for me on that topic. But at that time, there was sort of a schism, because if we look at what, for instance, had been written in the first book on Roswell, where we have Charles Berlitz and his co-author, Bill Moore, write the first book, The Roswell Incident from 1980. A lot of the specifics that became famous or maybe infamous with that case weren't included in that book. Most of the general story was there, but some of the elaborate accounts involving, eyewitnesses of the bodies at the morgue and things, right, they didn't come along until Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt began to weigh in and interview more and more witnesses, which, although it seemed to expand the story on the one hand, it seemed to allow the skeptics a position where they could say, now the stories don't match, and this is obviously folklore. So as far as what really happened and what I think happened at Roswell, again, we can acknowledge that something crashed. The problem with taking at face value the United States Air Force position on that, which is it was Project Mogul, and that was classified at the time, so we couldn't talk about it, is that they lied first and said that it was a flying disc, and then they changed the story. So this is the first lie. It was a weather balloon. Then they changed the story again later and say, oh, now we can say that this was Project Mogul. Some, like John Greenwald, have pointed out other instances where they have essentially offered different explanations. And I've read much of the Roswell report that was published in the 1990s. There were actually two reports, one that came out in maybe the early 90s and then another that I think came out in maybe 97. And there are, for instance, cases where they try to say the bodies and the crash records that was remembered by some of the witnesses probably was related to an event in the 1950s that these people just sort of misremembered. And did we lose me?
I'm laughing because in the Air Force
connection here, gentlemen.
Not a problem. I'm laughing because I'm remembering in 1997 the Air Force published a book that was basically a 500-page doorstop called Roswell Case Closed. And one of their points was the bodies that were alleged to have been observed by certain individuals were really crash dummies that we now know weren't around until 1952. So I guess, looking at it through different ends of the telescope. And let's bring Micah back in here. In terms of witness-driven testimony, this is something that I've observed, especially in the course of interviews and chat rooms on podcasts and radio shows that I've done, particularly over the last few years, where you've got more and more armchair authorities who have read some books, who have watched documentaries, and who pride themselves on having an opinion on pretty much everything, even things that I don't have an opinion on because I don't have enough information to have an informed opinion. And I'm funny like that. I'd rather have an informed opinion. And otherwise, I don't have an opinion until I know more about it. But dismissing witness-driven testimony and giving the example of, well, when there's a car crash, people go into shock, whether you're in the accident or you observe the accident. The law enforcement people get all the accounts and they're all different. Well, still, there's a car crash and people are remembering to a degree certain aspects of it that do dovetail. I wanted to ask you personally, if you had read either of Don Schmitt and Tom Carey's Witness to Roswell or Children of Roswell in particular, those two books.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm familiar with them, and they came on the podcast a number of years ago to discuss another of their books, which was not that. I think it was, I think that book was the real Area 51 that they had come on to discuss.
Oh, sure,
but of course,
yeah.
Familiar with the case that they lay out as Tom and Don begin to kind of build on the Roswell narrative, and yeah.
One of the reasons I ask is because I actually worked for the city for 3 years. And in that time, part of my responsibilities were organizing the conference, but also the ticking of the machinery behind the door, so to say. And I had the unique experience of meeting a number of these witnesses, all of them at that point in their late 70s, or some of them well into their 80s. And particularly ones who were 12 years old, 13 years old at the time, and whose parents were somehow involved or involved to some degree. And a unique account, and I say this with the understanding that none of these witnesses were in it for the money. Nobody's getting paid. None of them were looking for fame or notoriety, living in a relatively small community in New Mexico in their 80s. None of them seemed to be driven by ego gratification. And then there's the thing of actually watching and hearing people give testimony of threats from, it seems like, a select group of military police officers. For me, this is when the possible mythology of such claims became very real. And again, one can argue dispassionately from an armchair position that, well, they just want their moment of glory here, as opposed to, I want to be on record with something that was life-changing for me before I die, to be blunt. And these accounts of young people being told, if they ever talked about what they thought they knew, that they would be taken into the desert along with their parents, and nobody would ever find their bodies. If they never said anything about it, have a nice life and good luck, and my goodness, you hope you do well in school, kind of stuff. This gets very dramatic sounding, but there is real drama in this aspect of the work. Some of the sharpest minds I know, some of my best friends in the work, who are not of the generation of hard metal machines from other places. I accept all of these as possibilities, but I need more to validate it for myself. And we come up against the conundrum of, I just don't have a spark plug from that model of UFO. I don't have the thumb of a gray alien that we can run a little DNA sample on. Plus, we are in a totally unregulated industry. We don't have a bar association or AMA that will yank our UFO investigators' licenses from us if we confabulate, if we lie, if we make shit up, if we go with what I would call orphan documents. Micah, I'd like to now kind of shift the conversation again to the debrief. You and your partner on this show, your partners, have created one of the most timely, sharp, thoughtful, in the moment broadcasts that are out there in the world of UFO podcasting and radio. Can you talk a little bit about how this came to be and what your focus is and where you hope to go with it? I really think it's a very important resource for people that have a serious interest in the subject and want to hear what I always hope I'm achieving, at least in the majority of my shows, intelligent conversation with knowledgeable people who give you a lot to think about and are, up to speed on the issues.
Indeed, yes. I mean, there are many components of the debrief, which include the fine, I guess, for lack of a better term, podcasts, although many of them are video, that our very own Chrissy Newton produces. Also, of course, Christina Gomez has been a contributor who has taken off and is doing her own project, and of course, with the full support of us. But you'll often see us on the various programs that we produce, engaging with the UFO topic and other things. Now, that's one component, of course, of what we do. The other is the fact that there's the real, website which sticks to strict journalism on aerospace, on science, on futurism. We occasionally cover the UFO topic there in our often lengthy articles, but the effort with that aspect of what we do, again on a multimedia kind of a approach, like we've attempted to take with everything from video, audio to the actual published articles, is to try and not so much lump UFOs in with science and astronomy and futurism, but to attempt to report credibly on that topic like those other subjects have been reported on for decades. And this coming back to everything that we've discussed, yes, there's been a sea change. When you see serious UFO reporting in the New York Times, that's a big deal. But many people began to kind of say that, with the publication of the ODNI report last summer, which was significant, I thought it was very important. But a lot of mixed opinions about it. Some people thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread, at least as far as ufology. Some people seem to interpret that as a big nothing burger. This is nothing we don't already know. There are very few actual details that are provided. We just saw the redacted, classified version of that report. And again, there was even more information included that was mostly redacted. So
a lot of symbolic value, but not a lot of new information, especially for people in the know.
Right. That's true, but after that report came out, I think, we even saw Lou Elizondo saying, things are going to get kind of quiet for a while, folks. And, there's going to be a little less news about this. I think our mission with the debrief has been, at least as far as when we're covering UFOs and any of the mediums that we present, we're trying to report on that credibly, and we're trying to have serious dialogue and discussions about that, and to make sure that we don't go into a quiet period. Unfortunately, I think that there have been a lot of very interesting developments in recent days that are very indicative, in my view, that this topic is here to stay. I mean, briefly, just to touch on a few of them, Tim McMillan's recent article that he published, which sort of vindicated, I think, in some ways, Lou Elizondo, but in the context of a official investigative body, the IG at the Pentagon, conducting an investigation into an individual. But it did have relevance to UFOs. And here again, putting UFOs into the national security and even the political context, which I think is important to do. Last November, we reported on the Gillibrand Amendment, and what at that time many were concerned might stall in the Senate, and we weren't sure if there would actually be a Gillibrand Amendment that was passed with the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2022, but it ended up being passed. It actually, to my amazement, passed. It was signed into law by President Biden, and now we have a UFO, or UAP as they prefer to call it, investigative branch within government. But wait, there's more, because going back to Thanksgiving of last year, as you know, we have that Airborne Office of, gosh, I can never remember it, the AOI-MSG. This is the Pentagon's exclusive to controlled airspace UAP investigative organization, and when that was announced that the AOI-MSG under the DoD was going to be the new UAP investigative component within government, a lot of people were concerned. Lou Elizondo, one voicing his concerns, saying, "Look, this is being run out of the exact same branch back in the day that led to a lot of a lack of transparency on UFO information coming from government. We need better. We need to push for lawmakers being able to have a say in how they would want a UFO investigative component within government to operate. And we got that with the Gillibrand Amendment. And then the last one I'll point out here also, just as we're doing quick hits, in terms of things that have happened in recent months. I covered, having, of course, been here in Brazil when this was all happening, the fact that there was recently a requirement passed by the Brazilian Senate, which is calling for UFO hearings. This effort has been spearheaded as far as senators by Senator Eduardo Girau, but there are numerous co-sponsors, just like in the United States. AJ Gevard, of course, has been very instrumental in helping to put this together, as has Rony Vernet, who is I believe, a Sao Paulo-based UAP investigator, and a young scientist as well. So, but just to point out, again, there are so many instances in recent weeks where we've had UAP developments, political developments, military developments, science developments, in not just the United States, but many countries around the world. And I think that's incredibly significant, Peter. So in a nutshell, those are the kind of things that we cover with the debrief. And we do hope to try and continue the dialogue. I don't think we need to go into a silent period. There's always going to be something happening. And through the diligence of researchers like, for instance, John Greenwald, many others, our own staff, and appealing through the Freedom of Information Act process, we continue to try and push for more details about, very relevant information to the UAP topic that the government, for some reason, and I think arbitrarily, and also in the furtherance of unnecessary secrecy, continues to withhold from the public when it shouldn't.
If you could have the answer to, or more information, or credible insight into any one aspect of the larger UFO question, or a particular case, to use the most dispassionate term, is there one area that comes into your mind, or one area of UFO studies, or one particular case, and it may even be one that you've encountered more recently in Central America? Is there, South America, is there any that is kind of at the front of your list at this point?
That's a good question, Peter. It's difficult to put I know that sounds strange, because most people would think you got to have a favorite, right?
Well, no. For me, it's like asking me my favorite movie. It just, which era, black and white, comedy, drama, yes. Foreign.
Exactly. And we encounter the same issue with trying to select a case that we would want to learn more about. But I guess going with a gut instinct, the first one that comes to mind, and I think it's as good a qualifier as any, that I've had at least some degree of personal relationship to, that is the disturbing disappearance of the pilot Frederick Valentich.
Ooh,
yeah,
outstanding.
Yes. Now I mentioned having a personal relationship to that, and there's, although I guess I have to be sort of brief here, but there's an interesting story to how that came about. I'd been fascinated in that case, Peter, for years. And I had been talking about it on one of my programs, a live show that we were doing many years ago. This was well in advance of the debrief, and back in my days doing the Graylian report, which some out there may remember, which of course you were also a guest on at least once, maybe a couple of times. And I'd been talking about the Valentich case and raising questions about it. And I think this might have coincided with the researcher Keith Basterfield, always does very good work. And he had obtained the government file from the Australian Aviation Authority on that case. So we'd been talking about it on the program, and a gentleman emails me, and Peter, I love when this happens, and certainly I bet you've had this happen more times than you can count. You go on a program, you're talking about a case that's very interesting to you, or has personal meaning, or right. Just baffles you, and somebody writes in and says, "Oh, I have a family member who was associated with that," and then you're able to piece maybe together another little portion of that puzzle, that emerging puzzle. And this is what happened. There was a gentleman from Australia who wrote to me and said, "I work with Freddie's former girlfriend, Rhonda, and she told me that she would be interested in talking to you."
Wow.
and I remember reading the email and kind of thinking, Freddie, who's Freddie? It didn't dawn on me, Peter. It didn't dawn on me.
Of course not.
Who he was. Yes, that he was talking about Valentich. And so they made arrangements for Rhonda and I to talk, and she and her husband Joe were having coffee in beautiful Australia, and I was having probably a brandy. It was late at night in the United States.
Yeah.
We had such a wonderful conversation, and Rhonda and I just became fast friends, to the point that, I mean, there have even been some who have written to me over the years and said, you speak so kindly about her that I think you allowed yourself to get too close to the witness in this case.
Oh,
And I'm like,
gosh.
well, about as far away from Rhonda as one could be, she being in Australia, and we do keep in touch periodically. But
Yeah.
what fascinated me was her account of some of the lingering questions about that case, Peter. For instance, there have been many who have speculated that Valentich may have been flying upside down, didn't know he was flying upside down, crashed into the ocean. I asked Rhonda, I said, did you ever fly in the plane with Freddie? And she said, oh yeah, hundreds of times. Well, not hundreds, probably dozens, I think would be
Many
how
times,
she said it. But
yeah.
she flew with him many times. And I asked further, did Fred ever fly upside down? And she said, oh yeah, he was a bit of a daredevil, and he would do like loop-de-loops and things. The night he disappeared, there were all kinds of speculations about his motives for flying to King Island. He hadn't filed a flight plan. Thereby the runway lights wouldn't have been on when he arrived. It would have been a very potentially dangerous situation flying late like that. Why did he fly so late and with no flight plan? I mean, many people have asked these questions. Speaking with Rhonda, she said, well, first of all, it was our 6-month anniversary, and he and I were going to have dinner that night.
Oh.
She said, I didn't get off from work at the chemist where I worked at the time in time, and this was in the day before cell phones. And she said, so I'd called from a payphone my parents trying to see if they would come pick me up and take me out to the airfield where Freddie had been waiting for me. And the parents said, honey, we can't help you. We've already got plans. We can't drop what we're doing right now. And so she tried to get out to the airfield, she said, and wasn't able to get there. And so Fred waited for her for an hour. And all of a sudden, this picture becomes a very different story from what, aviation authorities who have investigated this, UFO researchers, skeptics, and, proponents alike have argued. For instance, why did he leave late? Where was the flight plan? Some have speculated that the idea had always been just to fly out over the strait and come back because he was trying to log hours in advance of a pilot exam that he was going to be taking in the days ahead. Now, I don't know about whether that's accurate or not. That's entirely speculation, or whether the aviation authority would allow, for something along those lines. And if he had done that, it might have been fairly reckless, but it led to the circumstances that we saw. Rhonda, expressed to me, it was very difficult realizing that he had waited on me. I couldn't get there in time. We were going to fly together, come right back, go have dinner. She missed it, and he was never seen again, apart from the radio dispatch with Melbourne Air Traffic Control, where he's describing a green object that he said in the final moments, it's hovering, it's right above me, and it's not an object. Now, Peter, I just want to speculate, completely speculating here.
Yep.
Because there's no way we'll ever know. But there have been times where I've wondered if, rather than the UFO abducting him, people have thought, maybe it took him, it captured him. I've often wondered if Freddie might not have been flying dangerously low to the water, and that the craft was in some way trying to bring his attention to the fact that he was descending in altitude. I don't know. We will never know. That's entirely speculation, something I've wondered about that we'll probably never have enough data to be able to put a finger on. But what I did learn from speaking with Rhonda is that there were aspects of what her relationship with Freddie had been that I had never read in any of the reports, any of the books, any of the documents.
Sure.
And I asked her, I said, the skeptics who said that he was just, going off to another island to see a girlfriend that you didn't know about, and these are all actual allegations that were made.
Oh, I know.
I said, did any of them ever interview you, Rhonda, and ask you about these things? And she said, no. Philip Klass, none of them ever.
Philip Klass suggested that he was either on drugs or running drugs, which is classic Philip Klass. It would be dismissive if it wasn't so incredibly insulting. You have listened to the air-to-ground transmissions that, back from the tower as well, of him on your own?
I have not heard those. I've read the transcripts. I know that a few.
And
really?
It, when you said the Valentich case, it struck a chord in me as well. This was 1978. It happened in either November or October. And
October,
of course, in our it would make sense. In our circles, of course, that was big news. In November of 1978, we have the famous United Nations General Assembly Special Political Committee meetings on the modest proposal of establishing a UFO study committee within the United Nations, which passed and then died in committee. And the Volentich case is very hot at the moment. First, when you listen to the recording, and my understanding is he grew up flying. His father was a pilot. He was 20, 21 years old, certainly could have been a hot shot. But when he's talking about looking up at this thing, he would have had to have been tremendously disoriented, even to the point of physiologically disoriented, if he was flying upside down and thinking he was looking up, but in reality looking down at the ocean. That's very messed up. And at the end of the recording, there's a sound of metal on metal that runs for, God, I don't know, a long number of seconds. And then it's over and he's off radar. The reason I'm recalling it right now is because I attended those United Nations General Assembly meetings that Lee Spiegel had so much to do with putting on behind the scenes. And it was with my first close colleague in the work, Antonio Huneeus. We were both there. We had both worked as editors on a paper for the Secretary General of the UN through our first mentor, Komen von Kavetsky. And on the floor, speaking that afternoon were Jacques Vallée, J. Allen Hynek, Stanton T. Friedman, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Coyne, who had been involved recently in that tremendous helicopter incident over Ohio. Gordon Cooper was scheduled to speak, but we had a blizzard in New York like a day or so before, and his flight, I think from Dallas, was canceled. Dallas. Anyway, his statement was read into the record, but I think it was Hynek. I don't know. It's probably in the record somewhere. But the representative to the United Nations from Australia was there. And whether it was Hynek or Vallée, it might have even been Friedman, they turned and faced him and basically said, as memory serves me, all those years ago, Mr. Representative, Mr. Ambassador, whatever, a citizen of your country seems to have been taken 6 weeks ago in violation of the laws of your country, in violations of, every humanitarian kind of thing we can think of. And is your country doing anything about this? The thing I remember most was the look of murderous rage. How dare you bring me into this? How dare you put me in a position where I am compelled to be a center of attention here on this ridiculous issue that I wish was not coming up. It was an underattended meeting, and none of the delegates seemed to really want to be there. I think, again, this golden age of fear of ridicule. But I agree with you. There are questions surrounding this case. Rhonda's account for you, I mean, for me, that's very valuable firsthand testimony, even if it doesn't get us that much closer to the truth, because it's so personal. And what he could have been doing, what he should have been doing, no trace of the plane was ever found, no oil slick. This is one of those abiding mysteries that, we will simply have to make our peace with. We're coming into our last 5 minutes or so right now. Can you tell us what you're up to once you leave the beautiful country of Brazil? Will you be returning to Asheville, or will you be heading on to another destination?
Well, I will initially be headed back to Asheville. There's always a little travel lined up. For instance, at the end of May, I'm going to be participating in the UFO Disclosure Symposium out in Vernal, Utah, moderating a panel, but my colleague from the debrief, Chrissy Newton, and I plan to do a bit of research at one of the most infamous ranch locations involving the modern history of UAP. Leave it. Yes, indeed. If it all works out, that's the most important thing to me. It's not speaking at conferences or, writing and chronicling this phenomenon is very important. But to me, the actual field research is perhaps the most important thing and what I enjoy the most. what there's so little time for, it seems. After that, I do hope to get to Alabama and also attend the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies AATP event. Is that what they call it? The anomalous aerospace.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is in the furtherance again of, and it's a very respectful effort by the SCU to brand this as not another UFO conference, right?
No.
And to try, yes.
What Rich Hoffman and Robert Powell are doing, I think, is extraordinary. They have created this small organization, although it is growing, and vetted people very carefully. It's not like they're elitists or anything. They're looking for people with different kinds of credentials. I mean, somebody like me who has, my academic heights are a BFA in painting and film history, but because of my experience in the work, I've been accepted for membership, and I look forward to, I'm hoping next year that I'll be able to attend. And it's in no way do I see this as, conflict with larger organizations. We can use all the good work and all the good people we can get. What it all comes down to in great part, whatever the hell is going on with these other intelligences, these interdimensional forces, these theoretical, aspects of this study. One thing it is all about is people. It has the potential to bring all of us closer together. And over the last intervening years, that's become more and more my focus. I am, of course, incredibly curious, like anybody is, about what the hell it's all about. And, for those ones that are corporeal, where they are from, what runs, empowers their technology, how long they've been coming and going, what they have for breakfast. But it's really all about people. And as you know, there you are in southern Brazil. This is, for me, one of the most exciting aspects of this work. It's not a great way to earn a living, but sometimes the perks on the job are remarkable. Micah Hanks, it has been such a pleasure having you on this show. Can I ask if at some point in the future you will return here, either on your own or in dialogue with some of our colleagues?
I would be most delighted. Any opportunity to catch up with you, Peter, is truly a moment to treasure. So
that $5 bill will be in the mail to you very shortly. Listen, stay safe, travel safely, and a big hug. And I hope to see you before the end of the year. But, if you ever get up to this part of New York State, guest room, mi casa, su casa.
Indeed. Maybe we'll just have to do that, actually. We're overdue for an actual in-person catch-up, I do think.
Yeah, I mean, time that Ryan is free or whomever. Otherwise, we'll have to leave it off there. This has been Meanwhile Here on Earth with Peter Robbins and with my special guest today, Micah Hanks. If you've enjoyed this show, please tell your friends. We'll see you next week. Same time, same station. Stay well. Stand up for what you believe in and be kind to each other.